Thanks for listening. I hope that playthrough helped you a bit. Now I'm going to go through the piece and just give some tips, kind of by measure, for some specific techniques, and hopefully show you how to practice them and how to approach some of these difficulties. And I'll reference some of these by measure number, so I'd recommend just numbering those quickly if you can. So to start with, there are some kind of not tricky rhythms, but very exact rhythms, especially in this first line, that you need to count very exactly. I'm sure the judges for Allstate will be counting themselves and making sure you hold each beat the exact right amount. So obviously, I recommend practicing slow and with the metronome, of course. Just make sure you're solid on when you need to change notes, and that includes like all the dotted rhythms. That's why I said the first line, there's a lot of those. So changing exactly with like if it's a dotted eighth and then a 16th, make sure you count 3/16 and then change, so it doesn't sound like a triplet. The other thing, just one general thing about this etude, I think probably the biggest difficulty is all of the position work. Everything is in high positions. For that, make sure that you're holding your violin up as much as you can, and this allows your elbow to come in. So if you bring it in like this, you'll have a much easier time just accessing all the positions up here. Whereas if you're in a more like relaxed position, kind of here, it's just the angle is more difficult from the fingers. So you want your setup to look like this if you can. With these high positions, one really difficult thing, it's hard to get a good tone, especially in the G string. So look at this fourth measure, like. So there's, on most violins, there's a wolf tone right here around the B. It's just really hard. It's just that one note on the G string is really hard to speak. And some violins it's the B, sometimes it's closer to the C. It's around that area that it's the violin just tends to sound bad. But there are ways you can kind of get around it and make it as good as possible, because it does depend on your instrument. Some instruments have it worse, but everyone there are options. Everyone has options. So one thing that I have is this wolf eliminator. It's this little thing. I'll show it closer. It goes on the G string, and that will it helps. Just it doesn't kind of howl as much. It's easier to get a good tone. It's not completely free, like you still kind of have to manage the weight and speed of the bow to get a good tone, but it's a little easier. And those are pretty cheap. I'll see if I can put a link to one in the description. The other thing you can do is experiment with different strings. I know for the G string, the Eva Perazzi G string was just amazing when I tried it on my violin. And actually, I don't have it on right now. I'm trying some different strings, but that really helped the clarity in like the upper register. So I recommend trying that one. Again, strings are different for every instrument. So maybe the Eva Perazzi would not be as good on your violin. I'd recommend just experimenting with different strings if you can, to find one that maybe gives you a better tone up high. So moving on to some more specific things. Make sure you're very aware of when you need to extend and when you need to shift. So if you look at the second line, there's a measure 8. that's definitely going to be a shift because just that's a huge leap. This one, depending on how big your hands are, you can shift back. For me, I can reach back and grab the G sharp. It's not too bad. So decide what you want to do, but don't kind of be on the fence. It'll sound best if you're purposefully shifting or extending. And then here I think an extension is going to be best. I know that's going to be a difficult extension if you have shorter fingers or smaller hands. Make sure just again, reaching around will help, so the angle is better. So really go as high as you can for that A. Higher than you need to, because you don't want it to, you don't want it to sound like an A flat. And if you can, try to keep your 1 anchored down before you even do the extension for the D. So here you can keep your 1 down, because then if you don't do that, all of a sudden from this extension you have to place it down and hope that it's right. But if you have it before the extension, it'll be easier to be more consistent there. So next thing, look in measures 11 and 12, so end of that line. These you just have to save bow here, obviously, and you need to count and hold these to their full value. I'm sure the judges again be very strict with this. I recommend kind of tapping your toe or something silent to keep the beat, because if you just count in your mind, a lot of times you'd be surprised like how off you can get with no external thing to keep the rhythm. So I tap my toe to the quarter note to count to 3 on each of those notes. And the other thing, so you're saving bow on these. Make sure this E sounds really nice at the end. It might, I feel like the tendency is it kind of gets strangled because you're out of bow and then you start. One way to make it sound nice is just give it some extra vibrato. Just feel like that's a nice like ending. So you don't want to take time, but just kind of, I would recommend feeling that separate from the 16th notes to come. So, and then, so just as a way to think about it, obviously keep the rhythm as strict as you can. Now, there are a lot of grace notes here. I don't know exactly how they want you to do the grace notes. Usually they might post an errata specifying, I know last year they did, and specified to play all the grace notes as if they were regular note values. You could go for that for now. I think the grace notes will usually sound better if they're very deliberate. Just the little like flippant quality I don't think fits as well for this style, slow piece. So I would recommend going closer to the written value, like 16th notes in that case. I guess there is an exception though. If you look in measure 33, skipping ahead a little bit, I find this one's really hard to speak well. This high E on the A string. So I would recommend coming off of that one as fast as possible. So think about on that E grace note, think about the upward motion of the finger. Instead of placing down, I think it'll help you get a better sound quality there. There is a dash through it, which means it's a different kind of grace note. It's not necessarily full value. So yeah, I think that will help. So going back, so measure 16, you have these giant leaps. These are pretty intimidating, but not too hard once you get the hang of them. Obviously, you just shift, when you go up, shift on the finger that you're starting on. So going down is not too hard because it's just a first position. But just think about the position you need for this high C sharp and shift on your 2 to get there. The other thing that will help, it's kind of fortunate actually, you have these swells on each note. And obviously for all state, you always want to exaggerate the dynamics as much as you can, because the judges want to know you're paying attention to that, and want to hear your musicality. And these hairpin crescendo, decrescendos actually really help with the leaping here, because you can kind of get away with, you start from nothing, then swell, and go back to nothing, because then you could even lift the bow a little bit off the string, and then nothing. It gives you time to shift if you kind of gradually go to nothing, and it's just an easier shift. So think about going as quiet as possible on at the end points of each of those hairpins. So the next thing, measure 25, I think. You want to make sure for these eighth notes at the end, they're very broad. They're on the G string, so you get a nice sound. But I would recommend trying to make sure you're in the upper half for those, because then you have this long up bow. So getting into those, just think about that planning of the bow usage. Okay. In measure 30, for the tenths, if you're having trouble, I'd recommend thinking about extending backwards, actually. Obviously, when you're playing, you have to go forward. But in practice, try setting the top note first, and then extending backwards. I think especially if your hands are smaller and you struggle with this, it'll help a lot with setting those tenths in. It's just a way to think about it. So you could approach it that way even. And then here. You know, practicing it backwards like that might help. So one last thing, these trills at the end, it might be pretty difficult for the highest B. So make sure your third finger is right next to it. It's a B to a C natural. So it's a very small distance. For trills in this high register, I think about vibrato. That's that kind of same motion, moving the hand back and forth, because if it's just a finger motion, I don't know, it'll be really hard to sound good. There's so much pressure required to hit the string at this like height on the string, that vibrato just makes it easier. I just have my third finger just hanging out right there, and then so maybe that will help. One important thing for this piece that might be obvious, you have to do all the fingerings. It's kind of, the fingerings here kind of create an artificial difficulty, because a lot of them are not necessary. It would probably be easier to do them in lower positions, but I mean the all-state judges want to hear your proficiency in these high positions. It's the purpose of the Etude, and they can hear on the recording when you're not playing the difficult fingerings. They just sound different. So make sure you're doing what's written. It's the purpose of the etude. So thank you again for watching. I hope that my recording and some tips helped you with this piece. As always, feel free to leave questions in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. And I wish you the best of luck practicing this very difficult piece.